Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We welcome, of course, all those who are joining us on our heritage.org website and other television networks. We would appreciate everyone in-house making that last courtesy check that your cell phones have been turned off as we prepare to begin. And of course, we will post the program on the Heritage website for your future reference. And our outside visitors by online communication are welcome to send their questions or comments throughout the program, simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our discussion this afternoon is Dr. James J. Carafano. He is Vice President for Foreign and Defense Policy Studies. He is our E.W. Richardson Fellow and also directs the Catherine and Shelby Cullom Davis Institute for International Studies. He also serves as a senior fellow at the George Washington University's Homeland Security Policy Institute, serves on the Board of Trustees of the Marine Corps University Foundation, on the advisory boards for the West Point Center of Oral History, the Hamilton Society, and Operation Renewed Hope Foundation. He is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University and the Institute of World Politics and has served as a visiting professor at the National Defense University as well as Georgetown University. He has written several books, the most recent being his co-authoring of a textbook on Homeland Security, and of course he co-authored for Heritage our book on Winning the Long War, Lessons from the Cold War for Defending Terrorism and Preserving Freedom. Please join me in welcoming Jim Carafano. Jim?
Thank you. So I'm going to be extremely brief so we could get right to the topic. I want to start with a thank you. I want to thank our panelists, Chris, Kim, and Michael Hanlon, trying to put this together on the fly yesterday through all the ugly weather. I want to thank all of you for coming out in this. But we thought that this was such a critical issue. And if you were trying to follow us over the weekend, there were a lot of people talking about a lot of things, but nobody really had a chance to kind of catch their breath and really have a dialogue. And I think this is an enormous opportunity with three very seasoned analysts who've been looking at these issues and studying this part of the world for a very, very long time to actually have a deep breath and a kind of reasoned, principled discussion about what's happened, what does it mean, where are we going from here, and what are our options. So I couldn't be more thrilled at these guys for jumping in to do this. Chris is the executive director at the Foreign Policy Institute. Kim Holmes is a distinguished fellow with us. He has a long distinguished career, not just here at Heritage, but also with the U.S. State Department. Michael Hanlon, as the research director at Brookings Institute, is incredibly well-respected and very knowledgeable on these issues. So I'm so thrilled that the three of them volunteered to do this. I'm going to ask them each to stick to 10 minutes. And we're going to go, I think, maybe Kim, Chris, and then Mike. And then I have two questions I want to put on the table, and then we will try to get as many questions as we possibly can in before the end of the hour. So again, thank you so much for coming. Without further ado, I'm going to kick it over to Kim to start.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, all of you, for coming here today. Chris, it's good to see you. What I'd like to do is just offer a few preliminary observations about what I think the Ukrainian crisis means for United States foreign policy in general, and particularly on the perceptions of President Obama's handling of foreign policy. I have basically 2 points I will be making. And the first one is that looking at the unfolding of events there, and particularly the reaction from the Obama administration to what's happening in Ukraine, it's possible that we may have reached a watershed in what I call the post-Iraq era. For years now, we have, as a country, been traumatized by the aftermath of the Iraq War. And President Obama's entire foreign policy was premised on the assumption that the first order of strategic business was to avoid conflict at all costs, and above all, do not provoke one's opponents. The idea was that the days of great power rivalries were over. It was a new world. And it was a world where diplomacy was largely divorced from the balance of power. Now, it's possible that the Ukraine crisis is testing this assumption. Obama's reset policy towards Russia, if you look back and remember how it got started, really rested on the principle of undoing the tensions, as he saw it, with Russia that had been caused by President Bush's reaction to the Russian intervention against Georgia. In other words, it was specifically aimed at undoing that particular event. We should not be surprised then that Vladimir Putin drew the conclusion that we would eventually look the other way if he moved in a similar fashion against Ukraine. Now, it is probably true, you've seen this in the commentary over the last couple of days, that the flip-flops of the president with respect to Syria may have signaled indecisiveness to Putin, but I don't think that was nearly as important as the aftermath of the reset policy. Even after most had concluded that the reset policy was dead, the administration continued to act as if we needed Russia more than Russia needed us, in Afghanistan and Iran and Syria, for example. And we should not be surprised then that Putin believed that he could take a risk of invading Crimea, given the signals that had been sent to him by the president. The real question, I think, is this: what has the administration really learned from the crisis? Jimmy Carter learned after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan that his previous assumption about the supposed inordinate fear of communism was not really the cause of the sour relations with the Soviet Union. He learned that was not the case. It actually has something to do with Soviet ambitions. And to his credit, President Carter, to his credit, he actually reversed course in the last year of his administration, and Carter actually began the military buildup that Ronald Reagan accelerated when he took office. But the question really remains, or the question is, I should say, is whether President Obama will do the same, whether or not he will learn a similar lesson. He's been dramatically diminishing our military strength, and so far at least he's shown no sign that he's willing to change course. He's a man that has shown himself to be very attached to his view of the world. He's not known to change his mind very often. And his main interest over his presidency has been mainly domestic affairs. And so I would not be surprised that if he wants to defuse the Ukrainian crisis as quickly as possible and with as little cost as possible to his domestic agenda. So what I actually fear most is that President Obama will not see, as President Jimmy Carter did see, that things actually have changed. I'm afraid that he will desperately try to get back to normal as quickly as possible, and then he may try to split the difference between his old views of the world and the new strategic realities represented by Ukraine. In other words, he could very well continue marching down the path of weakening America's military power, for example, while pretending America's limited options that everybody seems to recognize that we have really has nothing whatsoever to do with him or what he's been doing in the world. I think that if that's the case, if he does take that path, the situation is ripe for miscalculation and for confusion. I could see President Obama talking tough one day and offering an olive branch the next. While frankly, that can confuse an opponent more than reassure or even deter them. He's been blowing somewhat hot and cold over Ukraine over the last 4 or 5 days. And also he did the same thing, of course, over Syria, which tells me that he may actually be confused about what power really means, particularly about the perception of American power by other countries. And I fear that he actually does not understand or could not understand actually how weak America has become. And this could either lead him to overplay his hand on the one hand or do the exact opposite and in desperation pull too far back, particularly if Russia continues to escalate the aggression and let the situation stand without not much opposition. That's my first point. The second point, which is the underlying context here, is that I think that we now have seen that balance of power actually still matters. We've been living with two ideas in the Obama era. One I've already mentioned is that we really don't need military strength much anymore because the era of great power rivalries are over with. But the second one was that any attempt to be militarily strong or to signal resolve was often interpreted by many of our countrymen as tantamount to wanting to go to war. Now, clearly, this is not the way Russia, and I would say also China, see the matter. To them, hard power still matters. They are not terribly impressed by President Obama's penchant to apply transactional analysis to international affairs. They don't want or even need to compete with America on a global scale, but rather to be the dominant force in their respective regions. And this means that territory, as we have seen over the last 4 or 5 days, means very much to them, which also means that hard power means much to them as well. For the past few years, the default position of the American strategy has been a kind of minimalistic realism. It's the assumption that because our power is relatively weak, we really cannot influence world affairs all that much, particularly with military power. It's interesting that the position is being echoed in response to the Ukraine crisis by many people who call themselves realists, and of course even some liberal internationalists in the wake of the Ukrainian crisis. But the interesting thing is that's not the way the Obama administration is reacting. It's talking of sanctions, it's talking of loan guarantees to Ukraine, and it's promising other punitive measures against Ukraine. So the question is, at least to me, is that does this represent a fundamental change in the administration's strategic approach, not just to Ukraine, but to the world, or is it just ad-libbing? Is it just trying to make the best of a bad situation and get through the crisis as easily as it can? I would think that for there to be a fundamental change, there would have to be not just a sort of a hardline position in promising punitive measures against Russia, but in the long term, a change in the perception of hard power, specifically the balance of power. I would think that the administration would have to start accepting the fact that power rivalries actually do still exist, and particularly that's how Russia and China see their relationship, strategic relationship with the United States, particularly in their border areas and in their specific regions. We know which view of history Putin has. He does not have the view, obviously, that Secretary Kerry would like him to have, the so-called modern view where the balance of power was a thing of the past that we only saw in the 19th century. That's not how they view the world, and it leads me to believe that this is something that we should be recognizing as well. I leave you with this. The real question is, we will be going through very specific measures about things that should be done here, and we were discussing that. And in response to the questions, I'll leave some of the details for that. But I'll leave you with two thoughts. The short run, to me, is not as important as the long run. The long run, I think we need to restart rebuilding our strategic position to signal that American retrenchment is over. And this will go a long way to signaling to Russia and to China and to other countries that this long drift in American power is going to be reversed. And the second thing we have to start thinking differently about is we need to stop thinking of military power as a metaphor for military intervention. We used to understand very well that the deterrent force of military power. Today, much of that has been lost, partly because of the legacies of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and because, frankly, politically, we didn't want to spend the money on the armed forces. But we used to look at deterrent power, the balance of power, as a way of avoiding war and keeping the peace, not as an excuse for using force. And that is a worldview that I think we should be returning to. Thank you.
Chris Griffith.
Great. Thank you, Jim, for organizing this conversation today. It's a great pleasure to be up here with Kim and Mike, dear and respected friends and colleagues. Would like to step back and try to provide some general observations, like Kim did, before we dive into the specifics of how to think about the crisis in Ukraine. One of the important points, and this is a rare moment in Washington, when we're discussing some of the immediate steps, and you can see this in the media and the commentary from the administration and even among its critics, that there is some broad consensus about what we should be doing generally with regard to the crisis in Ukraine and the objectives that we should seek to achieve there. My organization, the Foreign Policy Initiative, over the weekend, we issued a statement from three members of our board of directors, Bill Kristol, Eric Edelman, and Dan Senor, and that the objectives that they describe, because I work for a board of directors, so it's always good to speak to the objectives they describe. They're the ones that I agree with, and I think that they're ones that broadly describe objectives most of Americans want to see here. Deter any further Russian military intervention into Ukraine, restore Ukrainian territorial integrity and sovereignty, reassure America's allies in Europe, strengthen NATO's defense posture, and to impose costs on the Putin government. Broadly, these are objectives that most Americans want to achieve right now. But this particular circumstance, I believe, presents President Obama with a fairly stark choice. That ad-libbing was the term that Kim used. I would describe it as muddling through. He can either seek to muddle through this crisis, or he can use it to articulate a broader vision of the role that the United States should be playing and what we should be achieving through global leadership at this time. This is important because the Russian invasion of the Crimean Peninsula is, in my view, symptomatic of a world in which we see growing pressure against our allies, our security partners, our friends in many areas and many regions simultaneously. Would compare this moment perhaps to, that once again Kim mentioned the example of President Carter facing the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Would compare it both perhaps to President Truman in 1947 looking at the Turkey Straits crisis, which was a very specific circumstance to which there were specific measures taken in terms of U.S. military and economic assistance provided to Turkey, was also the opportunity for President Truman articulated the Truman Doctrine for American support for free peoples struggling against tyranny globally. Similarly, in 1979, the invasion of Afghanistan was a moment that led immediately to Truman's description of a U.S. commitment towards the Persian Gulf region, but also led to the groundswell of the new thinking about what the final days of our eventual showdown with the Soviet Union that led to its collapse during the Reagan and Bush administrations in the 1980s. As we look around the world today, we can see this global pressure. And just to speak to a handful of examples, the U.S. Navy says that China is preparing for a short and sharp war against Japan over disputed territories. Iran is defiant in negotiations over the future of its nuclear weapons program. Syria is being torn asunder by the regime of Bashar al-Assad, who is using incredible weaponry against a civilian population in the civil war there. We can see that human rights are threatened from the Middle East to in our own neighborhood in Venezuela. And in the context of these challenges, which range from traditional allies to security partners, to countries that we are friendly with, to simply persons whose aspirations we should and do support, this is a moment where an uncertain trumpet will echo resoundingly throughout the world. So, in my view, the President should use this opportunity both to pursue the specific measures that the crisis in Ukraine demands, but he should also be conscious that he's speaking to three audiences, and will speak to those audiences in describing that the United States will punish aggression, stand with our allies, and support the aspirations of people globally for freedom. And we'll speak to those three audiences that he must speak to. So first, our foes, most clearly Russia in this case, Putin personally, those who support him immediately. And when you look more broadly at countries like China, the Assad regime in Syria, Iran, they're looking at this moment as a test of American resolve and whether they can engage in similar aggressive steps in the future without facing a strong American response. A great Washington Post editorial over the weekend concluded, I quote, "These men will not be deterred by the disapproval of their peers, the weight of world opinion, or even disinvestment by Silicon Valley companies. They are concerned primarily with maintaining their hold on power." I believe that point is true. And looking at that challenge, there are three immediate steps that make sense. One is to punish Vladimir Putin and his cronies personally by taking sanctions against them, their persons, their finances that have consequences for their ability to enjoy the benefits of living in the kleptocracy that is the Russian Federation today. Point number two in that regard, that the United States has about $40 billion of bilateral trade with the Russian Federation. The European Union has almost $500 billion. That at the end of the day, we have a fairly minimal relationship with Russia. This is a point that was expressed very clearly last year. You may recall there was an effort to boycott Russia over its treatment, its anti-gay laws that it's passed, that criminalizing certain free speech in Russia, no one could find a Russian product to boycott because we just simply don't import enough from them. That went after their vodka, then we realized it's not actually Russian vodka we're importing. That's the way these things go. But at the end of the day, if you're going to see really effective sanctions on Russia, it's going to be with U.S.-EU cooperation. An immediate step, and there's two tracks there. They're both speaking to the individuals responsible for this particular act of aggression against Ukraine. Then there is the model provided in the United States by the Magnitsky Act, which requires sanctions on certain nations who have engaged in gross human rights violations at home. And we should be speaking to our European allies that they too should adopt similar legislation imposing sanctions both for this particular act of aggression and more broadly the state of human rights violations that characterizes the Russian Federation today. Third, in our Congress should look to consider if there's now a bill that would take the Magnitsky Act's sanctions for human rights violations and make them applicable not just to individuals in the Russian Federation, but globally. And whenever we're looking at the types of countries that both abuse their populations at home and threaten their neighbors, that these things are interlinked. And obviously, this is a situation that applies from countries, Iran, China, broadly. But once again, as legislation sitting in Congress that deserves to be considered. The second audience, our allies, our partners, the peoples who look to the United States traditionally for leadership. Ambassador Eric Edelman, who serves on my board of directors at the Foreign Policy Initiative, has pointed out that the Russian incursion into Ukraine sends a particularly dangerous message because with the dissolution of the Soviet Empire, Ukraine at that time inherited the nuclear weapons that happened to be located on its territory. It reached an agreement by which it returned those weapons to Russia as part of the 1994 Budapest Declaration, in which we'll quote, Moscow committed to, I quote, respect the independence and sovereignty and existing borders of Ukraine, end quote, and also to, quote, an obligation to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of Ukraine. As it stands, this act of aggression, despite that declaration, stands as a very dangerous message to any country that currently does not have a nuclear weapons program, that by surrendering its nuclear weapons, quite literally, Ukraine made itself vulnerable to invasion by Russia. What steps should we take in response to this? Four immediate steps. One, in literally human-to-human physical engagement. The visit of Secretary Kerry, I believe he's speaking on television as we were coming over here this morning, to Kiev is a step in the right direction. It would have been more beneficial if Secretary of Defense Hagel also visited Ukraine, and we should see visits by other NATO and European Union foreign and defense ministers to express their support for the newly established government and the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Two, assistance. That the Ukrainian economy is a disaster in many ways, that the Ukrainian military will require significant assistance if it's supposed to have confidence in its ability to defend itself going into the future, that for both the United States, NATO, there's a need to assess what are Ukraine's economic and self-defense requirements and to expeditiously provide for those requirements, both through NATO and bilaterally between the United States and Ukraine. Just as an example, in 2008, after the Russia-Georgia war, within a month, Congress passed an amendment to the Defense Authorization Bill that would provide $50 million immediately for Georgia, just a down payment on the type of assistance that's required here. Three, the need to enhance NATO's deterrent posture against Russia and the possibility of future Russian aggression against current NATO states, let alone potential future NATO states, as the case of Ukraine and Georgia. There's broad activities that could be taken here, looking at the future ground force basing in Europe collaboratively between the United States and our NATO partners. But this comes immediately to the fourth point, which is another one where I would agree with Kim, is the idea of the U.S. defense budget. that we're now in the third year of deep cuts to U.S. defense spending. The consequence of these cuts is that since the president came into office in 2009, we were spending about 3.7% of our economy on the base Defense Department budget. That number is now down to 2.8%, so about a 1% reduction as a share of GDP in base spending for defense, and which incidentally is the same level where we were on 9/11 2001. So you can see how far we've fallen compared to where we were just a few years ago. And what we're seeing today is harm immediately to U.S. readiness and capabilities, and in the long term, major reductions to the size of U.S. forces and ground modernization programs, which when you look at a situation like this in Europe, the idea that U.S. ground forces are irrelevant to be able to send a message about credible defense and to reassure our allies or to deter our adversaries, I think that the hollowness of that argument becomes very clear. As a final point, in terms of audiences, the president must use this opportunity to speak to the American people and explain our purpose in the world. A majority of Americans now believe that the United States should mind its own business. And a majority of Americans now believe that the United States is less powerful than its decade ago. This is not entirely surprising when they're told that the United States should focus on nation building here at home. This is not surprising when our objectives, even in an immediate war, like we see in Afghanistan, where American soldiers are fighting and dying on the ground, our objectives there are not clearly explained repeatedly by the commander-in-chief. Despite that, when you ask them, a majority of Americans, overwhelming, 80%, believe that the United States should exercise global leadership and collaboration with its allies. Near 80% believe that we should listen to the needs and interests of our allies. That there is an audience in the American public if the president seizes this opportunity to explain why and how the United States must lead. And with that,
Thank you. So we go from Chris Griffith from the Foreign Policy Initiative to Michael Hanlon at Brookings. I have a double thank you for Michael. I bounced him around like a ping pong ball yesterday while we were trying to put this together. So he's not only a great scholar, but he's a gracious colleague. So over to you.
Thank you, Jay. I think your colleagues are entertaining my daughter out in the, so I owe you the thank yous. It's a pleasure to be here and an honor to be on this panel. And I heard a lot of ideas that I agree with. And so let me maybe begin with just two broad observations, not so much of direct disagreement, but of slightly different perspective, and trying to understand first the broader place we're at with American foreign policy today, and then trying to understand a little bit about what might be in Putin's mind, or at least how we might want to try to steer Putin. And again, I agree with many of the specifics that I've heard, and I know we're about to get into a more detailed discussion of some of them as well, so I'll save that part for a few minutes from now. On the broad interpretation of President Obama's foreign policy, let me begin with a couple of the points that Kim made that I think President Obama should be thinking harder about and correcting, but then also offer a somewhat different take that he shouldn't necessarily feel that Ukraine's the place where he has to somehow show that he's more resolute. On my biggest critiques of President Obama's foreign policy, which I think has been better than some argue, but nonetheless, there have been a couple of notable cases that have been growing in salience the last couple of years. And one of them certainly is the failed policy in Syria, where I think President Obama not only is witnessing a very tragic situation, but actually should be willing empirically to recognize that he made the wrong call in 2012 when he decided not to take the advice of his advisors and many others in this town and arm the Syrian insurgency in a more concerted and consistent and serious way. You can understand why he made that decision, but empirically speaking, it hasn't worked well because Assad hasn't been overthrown, and perhaps even more importantly, the al-Qaeda affiliates in the Syrian opposition have only grown in strength. Remember, we were worried about those groups potentially getting some of our arms, and that's part of why we didn't give them arms. Well, what happened was perhaps even worse. So let's look at Syria and say we're failing, and let's correct that. Let's look at Afghanistan, as Chris just mentioned, and let's say that the president owes the country and the men and women in uniform of this country a little bit more positive rhetoric than simply that we're ending this war. Which, by the way, if it were the only thing that we were doing, you'd wonder why it took us 4 years to end it, because we've been using that rhetoric for almost 4 years now. And I would say the president's policies have been better than his rhetoric. And we've actually made more progress in Afghanistan than he or many talk about and recognize. And when you talk about ending a war in Afghanistan and then you don't engage in an effective policy in Syria, it does invite these criticisms that somehow American foreign policy has lost its resoluteness and its strength. However, I look at the overall record and I see a little better record. Now, this is not really to disagree with Kim, because I actually think the administration needs to fix the mistakes it's making and then tie this all into a broader message about American engagement in the world and not just talk about nation building at home. So I agree there's a need for a correction. But I also look at foreign policy in this country right now, and I see a president who really is committed to Iran not getting a nuclear bomb on his watch. There are different people who have different views on the interim agreement that's been signed, on the prospects for a longer-term agreement with Iran. The president himself does not seem that hopeful about it, but I actually believe him, and we'll see if my confidence is warranted, that he will not let Iran get a bomb on his watch. I also see the president trying to do the responsible thing in Afghanistan, even though his rhetoric is not very resolute. His actual policies have been careful and gradual. And in the last week or so, we've seen him basically decide, as I interpret it, not to just implement the zero option because President Karzai refuses to agree to a long-term accord, but to tell President Karzai, listen, we're just going to deal less with you and wait for your successor, who we think will want that accord, which we also recognize to be in our interest. And that's the way I interpret that. On the Asia-Pacific rebalance, I think we're all in trouble here because our collective politics are putting so much downward pressure on the defense budget. And we can get into a lot of different debates about who's primarily to blame for that. And I would personally assign blame fairly widely. But I would basically say we are cutting too fast. And I was glad, therefore, last week when Secretary Hagel unveiled his initial speech on the defense budget to see that he and President Obama are going to ask for $26 billion more for the 2015 budget. In other words, the December deal that was just agreed to was not that good of a deal. It was better than the prospect of immediate sequestration, but it was not a very good deal. And I hope that we can actually, with whatever kind of bartering and modification needs to happen next, find a way to get most of that $26 billion back into the 2015 defense budget, and then find a way not to have sequestration take into effect in 2016. And by the way, knowing that I have good friends in the Republican Party who are making the kind of pitches we just heard today, knowing that I think Hillary Clinton, if she runs, is going to be not a dove on defense, I'm looking forward to a fairly robust 2016 presidential race, which I hope will re-elevate the need for American resoluteness in international affairs. I think we do need a dose of that. We know there are competing elements in both political parties that don't want to hear that, and that do want to do nation building at home. And I understand that argument, but I think we need a little bit of a rebalance on that one as well. So again, in summary, President Obama, therefore, has a better foreign policy than he himself sometimes acknowledges, and he shouldn't actually base his Ukraine policy on the need to prove that America is re-engaging. Because the stakes here, I think, are simply too high, and the risk of making the wrong decision too high to use Ukraine as a litmus test for American leadership. Let's fix Syria and Afghanistan policy, and then let's debate Ukraine on its own merits. That's point one. Point number two, and this is sort of intended as an attempt to get at the worldview of Vladimir Putin, and I don't claim that it's necessarily accurate, but it's been haunting me the last couple of days, so I'm going to burden you with my view. What's the analogy for Putin in American foreign policy to what he's doing now? And I've been thinking about, and by the way, don't worry, I'm not justifying Putin based on this, and I'm going to come back in a second and say why I don't think it's a good analogy. But he hasn't articulated this, but maybe it's Panama 1989. Because in Panama in 1989, we had Noriega in power. We had the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal was something that was very important to American strategic interests. We had a lot of Americans who had been in Panama for a long time. And President H.W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, saw the kinds of criminality in the Noriega regime, a lethal attack on an American serviceman, and other reasons, including drug trafficking, why he didn't think that government was legitimate any longer, so he overthrew it. And perhaps for Putin, this is an analogy to what's going on now in the Crimea. Now, here's why it's not a good analogy and why we got to get Putin away from this kind of thinking. First of all, Noriega really had proven himself to be a dictatorial monster. And if there's any analogy in this situation with Noriega, it's Yanukovych. It's not the new government. And we've learned more and more about why Yanukovych is a bum. And Putin's position that Yanukovych is the only legitimate leader of Ukraine, you can make a legal argument about that, but it doesn't hold water. And so we've got to get Putin off that. But maybe this is part of why he thinks in these sort of terms. Secondly, the Panama analogy would not be a good one for Putin to invoke, because we declared from the outset we were going to stay only for the minimal amount of time needed to restore order and allow democracy to return to Panama. And that's what Putin needs to be held responsible to do now. Very specific point. I'll save the broader discussion for our conversation we're about to have here in a minute. Why haven't we demanded that Putin clarify his intentions? Now, I'm not saying I would believe anything he said, but why don't we say to him, do you plan to stay in the Crimea in all these different locations indefinitely? Because what we need to do is force Putin to either admit that A, he is thinking in secessionist or annexation terms, or B, to get him on record saying he'll get out as soon as he possibly can and return simply to the use of the base in Sevastopol and otherwise recognize that Crimea is for Ukrainians. I want him to be held accountable to make that kind of a declaration, because what I'm really worried about is not so much what he's done so far. It's not very pretty. It's a thuggery. It's old school. It's Russian chauvinism and nationalism at its worst. But not a lot of people have died, and there's no permanent declaration of forced annexation. So that's what I'm worried about, the possibility for this to escalate. And I want to get all the tools on the table now that we can use to prevent a worsening of this crisis. My basic view is we've gotten so much better at applying economic sanctions that we have a powerful litany of sanctions that we can use. And we should start thinking hard, as people have begun, about how we do that. And it should be very clear to Putin that the world is going to apply sanctions in a major way for a long period of time, not just for a few months, if he seizes or stays in charge of large swaths of Ukraine, tries to forcibly restore Yanukovych to power, or otherwise punish the Ukrainian people. That's the line in the sand I want to see us start to draw, and worry less about whether everything that's happened so far has been properly handled. I don't agree with it, but if we can somehow undo what's happened over the next few months in the Crimea, it won't be a catastrophe. What could be in the offing, however, might very well be a catastrophe, and that's what I want to focus on preventing. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So I couldn't have asked for a better set of opening remarks from the panel. It's a great, whole fruitful areas to discuss. So here's what we're going to do from here. I have two questions, and then I have a question from an email that I need to ask, but then we'll throw it up to the floor. So if you'll be thinking about your questions, and if you have a question, when I come to the audience, if you would raise your hand and wait to be recognized, and then wait for the microphone so everyone else can hear your question, and just state your name and affiliation, and try to make the question as briefly as possible so we can get as many in as we can. We'll proceed, and then we'll try to end directly at the end of the hour. So the first question is Heritage, we put out our list of recommendations today, and I wanted to ask you about one in specifically, which is probably one of the most dramatic and most controversial, and maybe counterintuitive to some people, which the recommendation is that the U.S. should pull out of the New START Treaty, which was the strategic agreement that was really the cornerstone of the Russian reset. I think our argument would be that there is no strategic advantage for the United States being the treaty, and that withdrawal from the treaty would be the most dramatic and impactful statement about the future of U.S.-Russian relations, particularly the strategic relationship, which at the end of the day is the most fundamental thing that we have with Russia. So I'd just like to run the panel very quickly and get your thoughts about that. So, Chris?
This is the danger of sitting closest to the moderator. Whenever I know I'd give a much better informed answer after hearing Kim and Mike. I haven't read the full paper. A couple of thoughts that come to mind. Immediately, I don't clearly see the benefits of withdrawing from the New START Treaty along two lines. There is a day-to-day benefit of having the monitoring and compliance provisions of the treaty that to provide some insight into Russian behavior with its strategic nuclear forces, and two, in terms of if we don't live in a universe in which we have an administration or prospectively an administration that would withdraw from the treaty in order to retain the option of expanding our nuclear forces or somehow moving in other directions, that this is an administration that wants to conduct additional cuts. So I don't see that the immediate value there. that the argument along those lines, that certainly after the New START treaty was announced, that President Obama reached out in a speech in Berlin, I believe, last year, speaking to the prospect of additional U.S. cuts to our strategic forces negotiated with the Russians, which they immediately said they weren't interested in, and this year perhaps will double down with the prospect of additional cuts beyond what was offered in that last offer that was ignored at the time. Yeah, I don't think that's going in a useful direction with a government that has no interest in easing tension. So I'm somewhere in the middle, that I don't see value in further cuts, certainly from where we are, nor from walking away.
You know, one of the great ironies of the charge that you hear both from President Obama and also Secretary Kerry about not wanting to go back to a Cold War perspective on relations with Russia is that the focus that was represented by New START was doing exactly that. At the time when it was proposed, we at Heritage, we were scratching our heads by saying, I thought we supposedly moved beyond the strategic nuclear arms competition between the former Soviet Union, Russia, and the United States, and yet this was a centerpiece of the administration's approach. So we opposed ratification of the New START to begin with because we just thought it was a bad deal. We thought it was lopsided in Russia's favor, and we thought it also was basically cover for really what I think was a preference in the administrations for the preferred reduction of U.S. strategic forces, and they saw it politically and even geopolitically as a way of moving in that direction. So I wouldn't at all be upset if we pulled out of it, but I also would say that I would add to the mix that Russia is, their charges, there's information that Russia is violating the INF treaty as well by developing cruise missiles that exceed the range of the limits of that treaty. And yet you really hear nothing out of the administration, hardly anything about that. It's pretty much buried. So my point is that this is part of a larger piece. It's not just what we do with New STAR, but also if you let the violations of the INF treaty go forward without any protest, that's just one more signal that the United States is not serious about the relationship.
Jay, interesting question. I guess I support New START, but rather than get into a prolonged discussion on that, and all the points that Kim's raising and Chris is raising are valid, I would agree to debate. I would simply say it's an example of the kind of thing that we should begin to put in play. Whether I agree with you on that particular point, there should be a clear message to President Putin now that your next step is crucial. Yeah. So far, we're sort of teeing up ideas. But if the next step is wrong, some big stuff is going to start to happen in response. And that's, I'll leave it at that.
Okay, great. So I just have one other question, and because the focus has all been on the Russian reaction, and what's lost was the conversation we were having the week before, which is the future of the Ukraine itself. And regardless of whether Putin moves forward or not, this is a deeply troubled country with some real issues. So I went in our Index of Economic Freedom, which is online, and so if you look at their score, they've got this remarkable uptick, which is saying, oh, gee, things were getting better. But you kind of have to read the whole page. So one of the things you find is that they're 155th in the world, and they're 42nd in the region. So here's a large country with all kinds of resources and prosperity in an important geostrategic place, and they're one of the poorest performers in the world. And then when you actually read about, well, what's holding their score back, it's basically political interference in the country and rampant corruption. So these are serious structural problems. And so now we have the Crimean invasion on top of that. But any thoughts about how this country begins to right itself and move forward in the midst of this confrontation?
Well, once again, I believe you look at Ukraine, you look at its economy, I believe it has the largest share of pensioners of any economy in the world. And the initial motivation where the Euromaidan protests begins, the question last year of a closer relationship between Ukraine and the European Union, it comes down to the question of, will Ukraine move toward the West, which will require the types of economic reforms that can address corruption, that can address a sclerotic state-managed economy, or will it move into the Russian Putin-dominated sphere of influence. And if the latter happens, you don't see progress towards the reforms that Ukraine ultimately needs. So that is the key question that as the chaos in the Crimea happens, that is being addressed in Kiev.
You know, when this crisis first exploded in Ukraine, I felt like I've seen this movie before. I mean, the Orange Revolution had the same players in it. And it was the same figures, and you had the same corruption and problems with the economy back then that you have now. And so after the years of since that Orange Revolution, not much has changed. And I think that until Ukraine figures out how to get its economy under control, to figure out that the oligarchic control is basically just making the economy the private property of just a few individuals, they're not going to be able to get out of this spiral of international crisis that they find themselves in. And I fear that what's going to happen is the same thing all over again, is that some of the people that the oligarchs are worried about inside Ukraine are worried about their own private wealth. And they may even be sending some people to Moscow to try to get some kind of agreement. That may be a great news as far as diffusing the crisis is concerned, but that will only mean that you're freezing the fundamental corruption in the economy, and therefore we could very well be seeing this kind of crisis continue again in the future.
I guess I would simply offer that, first of all, I'm glad you're underscoring this point, Jay, because a good friend of mine, former ambassador to Poland, Lee Feinstein, just wrote a good piece at foreignpolicy.com where he pointed out that at the end of the Cold War, Poland and Ukraine, comparably sized countries more or less, had about the same per capita GDP. I think Ukraine was actually slightly ahead at that point. And now Poland's 3 times richer per person. So just to underscore the gravity of this economic stagnation that's been ongoing in Ukraine for so long. I don't have a good answer on how to fix it, but I would use this argument as one more tool against Putin when he tries to claim that Yanukovych is the legitimate president of Ukraine. By some legalistic interpretation, sure, you can force that argument down people's throats. But the point is that Yanukovych had lost his legitimacy because of economic mismanagement. What we need now is to create a process that's inclusive enough that ethnic Russians feel part of it and serious enough that all Ukrainians can feel like they have a greater hope in whatever political system is created by the next round of elections. And I don't know how that's how that can happen, but that's the combined project we should be working with all Ukrainians, including ethnic Russian Ukrainians, and with Putin on. And we should dramatize to Putin that what's not acceptable is putting Yanukovych back for the very reasons you mentioned, including the economic one.
Yeah, just to underscore your point, so the Ukraine in this year's index ranks 155, 155th. Poland is 50, right? 100 places higher, over 100 places higher. So I have a question online, so I'm gonna throw this out to Mike, and then if anybody else on the panel wants to address, that's fine, and then we'll just go to the floor. So this is a question from an online from the Washington Times reporter online. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov has cited the presence of Russian citizens and compatriots as justification for Russian troops entering the Crimean Peninsula. Does this set a dangerous precedent for other Soviet republics in Russia's neighborhood? And is there a risk that this Russian policy will fan unrest among Russian-speaking populations in the region? Mike?
It's a great question, and this is one of the issues where I thought Secretary Kerry was at his best in his speaking over the weekend, because one of the things he said is, that's a bogus argument, Mr. Putin, because you had other things you could have done to address the issue of the safety of ethnic Russians, starting with asking international monitors to go. Now, the implication is, if those international monitors report really bad things, the world has an obligation to figure out a step to protect those ethnic Russians. But at the moment, these seem to be invented charges and certainly not confirmed in any way. So the kinds of measures that Kerry was suggesting, I think, are exactly the right ones for us to propose if we need to, for example, help ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine feel more secure.
Sure.
Yeah, one of the concerns I have is the implications of Ukraine for the Baltic states. Latvia has a fairly large number of Russian-speaking people inside its country, and the same arguments that could be used that are used in Ukraine could be used against Latvia. But of course, Latvia is a member of NATO, and the question is what do we do to reassure the Baltic states, Poland, and other countries inside NATO that this kind of new attitude from Russia is not going to apply to them. The problem with NATO for many years now is it lacked a strategic identity. If you look at any of the documents about NATO's purpose, you will not see any mention, or very seldom see any mention or reference to Russia at all. It's been moving away from this direction for a long time, even though for the Baltic states, and I would say Poland, that was one of the reasons, main reasons that they joined. And so I think we got to find ways to be more serious about applying the NATO commitment, making it very clear that it does apply to the Baltic states, so it would help the Russians believe that in the future this is not a gambit that they want to risk with respect to these countries.
Chris?
Quickly agree and emphasize the positive side of the same story that Kim's speaking to there, that when you look at the Baltic states, that why hasn't their territory been trampled on by the Russian Federation? There's a strong argument that it's because of the NATO guarantee that we have with them. And when we look at the future of U.S. forces in Europe, of NATO planning, of our capabilities, it does speak to the importance, but also speaks to, there's a very positive outcome that we have achieved through the expansion of NATO. And looking prospectively becomes all the more important. Thank you.
All right, so we have 4 questions in the queue, so where's our microphone? Yeah, so right here in the center in the back.
Hi, Doug Brooks at the Afghan American Chamber of Commerce. It seems to me since the shooting hasn't started, all of a sudden the equation has changed, and it really looks like Putin's made a blunder here economically. And already we see the Russian stock market crashing. Our own stock market, which dipped a bit, is now booming again. It seems to me that our real ace in the hole here is economically, and future sanctions, everything else, really puts the onus on Putin to do something here. The time has switched to our side, so maybe our real decision should be how do we deal with this from an economic perspective, and then just wait him out, essentially.
Well, let me ask Chris, and if anybody else on the panel wants to weigh in.
Sure. Good question. I agree with the essence of the point. This brings up earlier a point that Mike had made in his commentary, that we shouldn't make Ukraine a litmus test. And I think that the key to this is that we don't necessarily get to choose what is a litmus test when it comes to how the United States is perceived in the world. And I think if you look at the points, certainly ones I spoke to, I think the ones they spoke to, the ones where it comes to punishing and putting pressure, it really is on the economic side. When it comes to expanding the credibility of our commitments and sending a message that further aggression is not acceptable, it comes down to additional investments through the NATO alliance, through the future of Ukraine, and through our own defense capabilities. So I think in essence, you have the key to it, that Putin has miscalculated, and the great saying, never prevent your enemy from miscalculating.
Mike?
Very quickly, I agree, and I just want to underscore that, lest there be any confusion. I think the question is, if Putin makes any further and worse decisions, then I think we have to come down like a ton of bricks on the economic front. I just want to quickly say that it's become, I think, a major bipartisan accomplishment in this town to be able to apply economic leverage more effectively over the last 10 years. We have enough intense debates about what to do next, especially towards Iran, that we wind up not necessarily, recognizing that collectively, first under President George W. Bush and people like Stuart Levy at Treasury, and then under President Obama, we've really managed to apply, and I should have said probably in previous administrations, we were showing the early signs of this. In the Kosovo War, we started to figure out how to target Milosevic and his cronies economically. And we've gotten a lot better at being precise, and we have very good unity among the Western world under both presidents, both recent presidents, Republican and Democrat. And we've got partners who have helped. Ironically, Putin even helped on a couple of issues in regard to Iran and North Korea. But we can do this pretty darn effectively, and let's remember that bipartisan accomplishment is a tool that may or may not be adequate, but it's a tool that's a little bit more sharply honed than it used to be.
Well, I think the sanctions that have already been proposed by the administration should go forward until Russia reverses what it's done. I wouldn't necessarily condition on any further action because we don't want to get into a situation where we have essentially a U.S. tacit agreement to what's already happened. And so if they reverse the situation, then we can look at maybe reversing some of the sanctions. As for it being a litmus test, I don't want to imply, didn't mean to imply that this is kind of like a strategic showdown with Russia and we're going to go to the mats militarily. That's not the case at all. But on the other hand, it is true that other countries like Iran and China are watching this, and not just Russia. They're watching how we handle it, not only how skillfully we handle it, but also whether or not we show the resolve that's necessary to get the situation changed.
So a question down here.
Hello, I'm Nikolai Vorobyov. I'm Ukrainian journalist. I was working in Ukraine for like last 5 years. Came like 2 weeks ago. Sorry for my English. I apologize because Soviets didn't want us to know English. So that's why we should study alone. So thanks for your presentation. It's really interesting, and I have like plenty of questions. But the main is, what's next? Let's come back to inner Ukrainian problems. I mean, despite the Putin has withdrawn today, he has withdrawn his military forces from Ukrainian border. The inner problems remain the same. I mean, the possible future president of Ukraine will be Yulia Tymoshenko. And as far as we know, she was in jail for 2 years, and she had a lot of common with Putin. So maybe they will be satisfied with this. The second is the Navy is still in Crimea. And according to the last treatment with the ex-president Yanukovych, it will be there till 2042. And the second is the oligarchs in Ukraine, within these like tensions with Russia, they took even more power. So, I mean, whom Americans will donate in this case? And the fourth, and last but not the least, that the people is still on Maidan Square, and they are not satisfied with the new elite, because it's old new elite. So how would you deal with a new government and with the old new elite in Ukraine?
Yeah. Well, I do want to say that your English is better than my Ukrainian. Let me ask Kim. His name's on the book, so he's supposed to understand all this stuff. So let me ask Kim to just put all those together and talk about what's the way forward for the Ukraine based on some of the other things we say, and if anybody else wants to jump in. So.
Well, as you know, Jim, we've argued many times here at Heritage that one of the things that was missing in our policy, not only toward Ukraine but other countries in the region, was an economic reform package. And one of the reasons why I'm ambivalent about, for example, the idea of a loan guarantee and economic aid to Ukraine, because I think it'll be wasted so long as they have the oligarchs in charge and they don't fix the problems of corruption. And so, I mean, we're dealing with a near-term crisis. The next couple of weeks we'll see what happens with the Russians. But as I said a minute ago, in the long term, if we don't start finding ways either to condition our aid or to come up with a better emphasis on trade and economic reform in our relationship, not just with Ukraine and other countries, that we're always going to be throwing bad money at the situation. And so this is a long-term problem, but at the very least, they could try to figure out, as we say in the index, how to get, less government control of the economy, to try to truly have a privatization program that doesn't end up with only a few number of people controlling the economy, and also basically have an economic liberalization program that brings long-term prosperity.
Anybody else?
Just quickly,
sure. Yeah.
Just want to point out that it's good to see Nikolai, that we had a pleasure of having him give a briefing at the Foreign Policy Initiative a few weeks ago. He is truly an expert on the developments in Ukraine, and would recommend anyone to seek him out. The second point, briefly, as it gets back to when you look at the way forward, and the question that, one of the reasons that Yanukovych rejected the relationship with the EU last year in favor of moving forward with the large loan from the Russians is because he didn't want to accede to the conditions that went to the European agreement. And ultimately it will be economic integration with the West that can pull Ukraine in that direction.
Great. So we have a question right here.
Gentlemen, good afternoon. Andrew Jensen with Harvard University. Thank you very much for your presentations. My question is, it seems one of the next steps that President Putin may take or support is a referendum on increased autonomy or independence by the Crimean autonomous regional government. My question for you is, in U.S. foreign policy, we've obviously supported the autonomy and independence of regions under duress. So Southern Sudan, Eritrea, Kosovo. We've also supported the peaceful independence of other sub-regions, such as Montenegro, and we likely would in the case of Quebec or Scotland. My question for you is, if there is a successful referendum on independence or accession to the Russian Federation by the local population of Crimea, what leverage do we have, what diplomatic leg do we have to stand on to dispute that result?
That's a good question for Mike, because you raised that issue.
It's a great question. I think, I'm not a purist on partition, but I think in this case, it's just too likely that it would be a very opportunistic use of a crisis by Putin to accomplish essentially a land grab. And I think the only way you could imagine it is if the process were slowed down, if it were separated by a long period of time from the immediate problems we're having today, if emotions cooled, if fears cooled, if Ukraine regained full sovereignty of the Crimea before any such discussion could happen, if there were plenty of international involvement in monitoring the various behavior of different parties so that it wasn't based on veiled threats and anything else, but based on people's real aspirations. I think most of us know that Crimea has, you know, a bit of a different place in Russian and Ukrainian history than other parts of those territories. And so it's not illegitimate to ask the question, but it is illegitimate to try to create a fait accompli out of this crisis in the short term.
Yeah, let me, so we have a question in the back row there, and then we're going to come down front, and that may be the last one, but we'll see.
Hi, Rachel Brown, EIR. When we overthrew Gaddafi in Libya, Lyndon LaRouche said that this is going to put us on the warpath towards Russia and China. And I'd also like to bring up the opposition in Ukraine, which is the Svoboda Party, the right sector, neo-Nazi organizations. Jews are being told to leave Kiev by leading rabbis. There's acts of violence all over the country. I mean, this, one, let's look at the nature of this so-called opposition. Two, the decision by Ukraine not to join the European Union, which is when this whole thing began. So what's the relationship of that, of the economic collapse of Europe, and the origin of these protests that have nothing to do with actually the leadership of Ukraine, but the decision not to join the EU. And now there's support by the United States, by the president, for neo-Nazi organizations in Ukraine. This is a very dangerous situation. It's putting us up against Russia. So I would like to ask you, would you really support a nuclear war with Russia?
Okay, so let me ask.
I think the answer is no.
I think I can speak for the panel and say no, but let me ask Chris to respond, and then we'll go down here for a question.
Likewise, no nuclear war. The question speaks to what I believe is a very important and significant development, which is the role of essentially that Russian-controlled media and propaganda in the context of Russia Today network, and that telling this story that's getting picked up in the Western media, which you can look at facts on the ground to look at why it's fundamentally not true in terms of the opposition that led to the overthrow of Yanukovych essentially being a Nazi-esque cast of characters that with anti-Russian leanings in terms of what would happen in Crimea and the East under their control. And if you haven't checked out the way that this media is carried, RT is the English language what you can access for Russian news in the English language. It presents a starkly different view of the world than the one I would argue that we live in. And whenever Angela Merkel warned that President Putin may be delusional, it was perhaps to suggest that he believes this narrative about the nature of the opposition and also the nature of the Crimean people in support of Russian ambitions in the region.
So if we have, I think, time for one last question down here in the front row, and this will be the last question, and then we'll wrap up. So, great, thanks.
Thank you very much. My name is Jeannie Nguyen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. I thank the Heritage Foundation. I think this is very appropriate that we have it debated here, discussed here. And I took Dr. O'Hanlon and Dr. Griffin proposal that maybe first we need to pay attention to our defense force, and would the Heritage Foundation support the repeal, however stop the sequestration. And I think the president had announced his budget this morning, and he did request for 26 billion more for defense budget. I hope the Heritage Foundation will support it with your connections. The important part I want to ask is, where is the role of China in this whole picture? Because this will send a message, not just to Ukraine, not just to Russia, but to the whole world, especially talking about balancing or rebalancing to Asia. We have a lot of unsettling conflicts and allies in Asia looking at how the U.S. is handling this. And the lesson from Georgia kind of put everybody at a very concern and uneasiness. So would you think that this is a good opportunity for the U.S. to test China in its aspiration of rising to be another global power? Can China step in and support us in sanctioning, support us in its action against Russia taking over Crimea? Because China is an important seat in the UN Security Council, and they had the meeting yesterday. I didn't hear much from China. Can we openly request China to make a statement saying that it's not supporting? And that would be a test for China to assert itself if it is worthy of a global power.
Thank you.
It has to share.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, that's a jump ball. Who wants to talk about China?
I'll offer a brief word. I think that it's an interesting question. I'm glad you raised it. And it got me thinking. I don't know that it's realistic to expect China to be forward-leaning on this, but maybe it's reasonable to at least ask them to consider making some statements that would be suggestive of where they might go if things get worse. So I'm not sure we can expect China to threaten Putin, even at the UN. But I think maybe China can start to say how important it is that this not go any further. That kind of veiled language may be a reasonable request, and it would be interesting to see if Beijing would consider it. My guess is they probably won't, but I think there are things that we could ask them to consider.
Chris?
Jump in, just agree entirely with Mike, and two observations from the points you raised. You mentioned the $26 billion that, in addition to the budget request that Secretary Hagel has asked for. And I think something to keep in mind as we look at the debate that's coming up over this defense budget is that if he gets what he asked for, if he gets the extra $26 billion, that still puts us on a trajectory to have the smallest army since the Second World War. That still puts us on trajectory not to have army modernization. That still puts us on trajectory to retire various forces from the Air Force. So that there's a bigger debate beyond this $26 billion is by no means a panacea. And just on a very quick second point, when it comes to since you mentioned work for a surrogate broadcaster, in terms of the importance of supporting surrogate broadcasting, and in countries, certainly Russia can be one, but others where the media is controlled by the government, that having opportunities to hear independent media voices.
There's not been much discussion, as far as I can tell, of the details of what kind of sanctions the administration really wants to impose, whether they be unilateral with the Europeans or who they would be with. But if they are to go down the road of asset freezes and sort of targeting specific people, there's a long history of doing that at the United Nations and the Security Council. I have to say, though, I'd be very surprised if China would support that effort in the UN Security Council. Perhaps we could ask and try it. But I tend to agree with Michael. Ukraine is not the place to draw the line with China. There's other issues that we have to work with them on.
Yeah, just a couple of things to clean up before we convene. So there are a whole range of issues here, many of which we just barely touched on, and some of them which you didn't touch on at all. So, for example, just at the end there, we got into a bit about public diplomacy and political warfare and issues about the role of RT in the United States and the future of Voice of America and some of our own public diplomacy. There's a huge information war going on out there attendant to this that's gotten very little discussion, actually. It's a really important point. There's been no discussion of the cyber wars. I mean, we know about the cyber war with Estonia. We know about this cyber war with Georgia. There's actually been very little press and media about what's been going on in Ukraine, and there is an element of cyber warfare going on there, and that's kind of interesting. We talked a little bit about New START and some of the strategic issues, but I think that's an area which we could spend forever. I mean, so for example, what lesson is Iran taking away from this in terms about do they really want to have a nuclear weapon or not? And what does that tell them about, do people mess with you if you have a nuclear weapon or not? And then Michael brought up a whole really series of interesting cascading, really key foreign policy crises for the United States, whether it's Afghanistan or Syria or a relationship with China. Just incredible breadth of issues. The one I really wish we'd had more time to get into, which all three of our panelists touched on, was the defense issue. And what are the implications for us? Not for go to war in the Ukraine, but really, in other words, what is the sufficiency of the United States to defend its vital national interests all around the world and not risk, in a sense, playing whack-a-mole or moving one place and compromising your interests someplace the other? I mean, I think we could spend an awful lot of time on that, and all these gentlemen have an enormous amount of different interesting ideas on that. One thing I would commend to you, a paper that we recently put out, I just happen to have with me, which is our Heritage 2014 Defense Reform Handbook, where we do look at a lot of these issues about not just, do we get $26 billion next year, but how do you have a sufficiency of military over the long term, and how do you afford that, and what's appropriate? So that just came out recently, so that's very timely. That's on the Heritage website, as are the other products I mentioned. This event, which I think really was absolutely, completely spectacular in every respect, and I just want to thank our panelists so much. In 24 hours, this will be up on our website, and folks can access that video, and it'll also, it's been carried live by C-SPAN, but C-SPAN will also be replaying it. The most important thing we have to do is to thank our panelists for figuring out how to get here today and rearrange their schedules and be so brilliant. So please join with me in thanking our panelists. Thank you so much.